desert night was cruel, colder than any blade. She stumbled barefoot along the hard-packed trail, her breath ragged, her belly heavy with the secret of life she carried. Behind her, the voices of her sisters still rang in her ears, sharp, bitter, dripping with shame. They had sold her like cattle. A handful of silver coins passed to a trader under the moon, her worth measured not in blood or bond, but in the weight of her disgrace, pregnant out of wedlock. To them, she was nothing but a stain, a secret to be buried. But the trader hadn't kept her. She was too frail, too slow, more burden than profit. He had left her at the edge of the frontier, discarded like broken goods. And so she walked, alone, trembling in the endless silence of the desert. The wind cut through her dress, and her feet bled against the rocks. Yet she pressed on, guided only by the flicker of lantern light in the far distance. A lonely cabin, small against the wide emptiness. Inside that cabin, the rancher was finishing his supper, a man long accustomed to silence. He had built his life on a solitude, the kind carved by loss and hardened by years of tending cattle and bearing his own ghosts. He did not expect visitors. Out here, they rarely meant anything but trouble. A knock came, weak, hesitant. His hand hovered near the revolver on the table. Another knock, softer this time, almost fading. He rose, boots thudding against the wooden floor, and pulled the door open. There she was, hair tangled, cheeks hollow, eyes wide with both terror and hope. Her hands clutched her stomach as if to shield the child inside. The rancher's jaw tightened. He knew trouble when he saw it. He had no place for strangers, much less for a young woman carrying another man's burden. Yet something in her eyes, something raw and desperate, stilled him. "I've nowhere else," she whispered, voice broken. The lantern light flickered across his face as he wrestled with the choice. Solitude was safe. Kindness was dangerous. Out here, mercy could get a man killed. And still, he stepped aside. She crossed the threshold, leaving the cold desert behind her. The door shut, the latch clicking into place, sealing them both into a night that neither would forget. He did not yet know that her past would come riding for her. And when it did, his own lonely life would never again be the same. If you want to see how one rancher's act of mercy collides with betrayal and vengeance, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. The story has only just begun. Dawn crept slowly over the desert, spilling pale light through the cracks of the cabin walls. The rancher was already awake, his hands rough from years of work as he stoked the fire back to life. He moved with the silence of a man used to being alone. But this morning, his solitude was broken. On the bed, the girl stirred. She sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her body. The band of light across her face revealed how young she truly was. Barely more than a girl, yet with eyes that carried too much sorrow for her age. Her hands instinctively rested on her stomach, protective and gentle. The rancher poured water into a tin cup and offered it to her. She drank greedily, water dripping from her chin, before pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, he asked, his voice low and even, "What's your name?" Her lips trembled before sound came. "Marisol." The name hung in the air, fragile as glass. He nodded once, setting the kettle back on the stove. "You walked far." She lowered her gaze, her voice a whisper. "I had no choice. My sisters, they sold me." The rancher's hand stilled on the kettle. His eyes narrowed, not in disbelief, but in a kind of grim recognition. Out here, he had seen the ways people could turn on their own. Yet hearing it spoken so plain, from the mouth of someone barely grown, gnawed at something inside him. "Sold you?" he repeated. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Because of this." She pressed her palm to her belly. "They said I shamed the family. Better to be rid of me than face the whispers." The rancher said nothing. His jaw clenched, his chest tight with anger he did not show. He had known betrayal in his own life. Friends who turned outlaw, neighbors who stole when the times grew lean. But blood turning against blood, that was something darker. Outside, the sound of distant hooves echoed faintly through the stillness of the morning. The rancher froze, his head turning toward the window. His hand instinctively brushed the revolver at his hip. He had lived too long on the frontier not to recognize the rhythm of riders approaching. Marisol heard it too. Her face drained of color and her hands clutched the blanket close. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The rancher stepped to the door, his eyes scanning the far ridge. Dust rose faintly against the horizon. Whether it was her sisters, the traitor, or someone worse, he could not yet tell. But one thing was certain. By taking her in, he had drawn trouble straight to his doorstep. The rancher stepped out onto his porch, the boards creaking under his boots. The morning sun had begun to burn away the last of the cool air, and in its glow he saw them. 4 riders cresting the ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the light. They weren't family. They weren't neighbors. He knew the type the moment he saw them. Men who rode together for profit, not kinship. Broad hats pulled low, rifles slung across their saddles, mouths set in hard lines. Traitors, outlaws, vultures. It didn't matter what they called themselves. Out here, they all meant the same thing. Inside the cabin, Marisol pulled the blanket tighter, her eyes wide. She had seen these men before. Her sisters had handed her over to them like a piece of unwanted stock. The rancher didn't need her words. The terror in her face said enough. The men rode closer, dust curling around their horses' legs. The leader, a man with a long scar down his cheek, raised a hand and called out, "Morning, rancher. Got word you're keeping something that belongs to us." The rancher didn't move. His hand rested easy at his side, close to the revolver but not yet on it. He'd lived too long in these parts to show his temper first. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the dry air. The scarred man chuckled, leaning in his saddle. "Funny thing, her kin already made a bargain. Silver was paid. She's ours by right. Best step aside." The other riders laughed, their voices harsh and ugly. One spat into the dirt. Another tapped his rifle against the horn of his saddle, a not-so-subtle warning. The rancher's eyes never left the leader. He knew how these games went. A man could talk circles about rights and bargains, but in the end, it came down to who had the steel and the will to use it. Inside, Marisol whispered a prayer in Spanish under her breath, rocking slightly as if to steady the child inside her. She had been sold, discarded, and hunted, but something in her heart told her that this man, this quiet rancher, with dust on his boots and sorrow in his eyes, would not hand her over. The scarred man leaned forward, his voice sharper now. "I'll say it plain. Step aside and no harm will come to you. Keep her, and we'll take her over your grave." The desert fell quiet. Even the horses seemed to feel the weight of the words. The rancher's jaw clenched. He had not asked for this fight, but it had come all the same. Behind him, the girl's whisper reached his ears, faint but fierce. "Please, don't let them take me." He shifted his stance, boots set firm in the dust. His hand hovered closer to his revolver. The choice had already been made. The rancher stepped out onto his porch, the boards creaking under his boots. The morning sun had begun to burn away the last of the cool air, and in its glow he saw them. 4 riders cresting the ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the light. They weren't family. They weren't neighbors. He knew the type the moment he saw them. Men who rode together for profit, not kinship. Broad hats pulled low, rifles slung across their saddles, mouths set in hard lines. Traitors, outlaws, vultures. It didn't matter what they called themselves. Out here, they all meant the same thing. Inside the cabin, Marisol pulled the blanket tighter, her eyes wide. She had seen these men before. Her sisters had handed her over to them like a piece of unwanted stock. The rancher didn't need her words. The terror in her face said enough. The men rode closer, dust curling around their horses' legs. The leader, a man with a long scar down his cheek, raised a hand and called out, "Morning, rancher. Got word you're keeping something that belongs to us." The rancher didn't move. His hand rested easy at his side, close to the revolver, but not yet on it. He'd lived too long in these parts to show his temper first. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the dry air. The scarred man chuckled, leaning in his saddle. "Funny thing, her kin already made a bargain. Silver was paid. She's ours by right. Best step aside." The other riders laughed, their voices harsh and ugly. One spat into the dirt. Another tapped his rifle against the horn of his saddle, a not-so-subtle warning. The rancher's eyes never left the leader. He knew how these games went. A man could talk circles about rights and bargains, but in the end, it came down to who had the steel and the will to use it. Inside, Marisol whispered a prayer in Spanish under her breath, rocking slightly as if to steady the child inside her. She had been sold, discarded, and hunted. But something in her heart told her that this man, this quiet rancher with dust on his boots and sorrow in his eyes, would not hand her over. The scarred man leaned forward, his voice sharper now. "I'll say it plain. Step aside and no harm will come to you. Keep her and we'll take her over your grave." The desert fell quiet. Even the horses seemed to feel the weight of the words. The rancher's jaw clenched. He had not asked for this fight, but it had come all the same. Behind him, the girl's whisper reached his ears, faint but fierce. "Please, don't let them take me." He shifted his stance, boots set firm in the dust. His hand hovered closer to his revolver. The choice had already been made. The rancher stood firm on the porch, sunlight striking across his face. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. 4 riders sat their horses just yards away, their leader grinning with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Last chance, old man," the scarred one called out. His hand tapped the butt of his revolver. The other 3 shifted in their saddles, restless, hungry for the show of force that always seemed to follow a refusal. The rancher let the silence stretch a moment longer. Then his voice came low, steady as stone. "You'll find no trade here. The girl stays. If you want to test my ground, you'll ride home lighter than you came." The men laughed, but it was a brittle sound, more for themselves than him. They could see it in his stance, the way his hand hovered near his weapon, not trembling, not rushed. He was no greenhorn. This was a man who'd drawn iron before and lived to do it again. Inside the cabin, Marisol clutched the blanket, every muscle taut. She could hear the men outside, their laughter mixing with the ominous scrape of spurs and shifting leather. Her heart raced so hard it felt as if the child inside her could hear it too. The scarred man spat into the dust, then jerked his chin at one of his riders. "Check the cabin, bring her out." The younger outlaw spurred his horse forward, dismounting near the steps. His boots crunched against the earth as he started toward the door, one hand brushing the rifle slung on his shoulder. The rancher shifted, his eyes never leaving the leader, but his voice cut through the air like a blade. "Tell your man to stop where he stands. One more step, and he won't take another." The outlaw froze mid-stride. The way the rancher spoke, calm without a flicker of doubt, sent a chill crawling up his spine. He glanced back at the scarred man, waiting for the order. The leader sneered, but his fingers drummed on his saddle horn. He hadn't expected resistance this sharp, this immovable. The silence stretched again, broken only by the restless snort of horses. Finally, the rancher's voice came again, softer, but it carried like thunder. "I've buried men for less." The scarred man narrowed his eyes. His grin faded into something colder. The game had shifted, and for the first time that morning, he weighed the cost. Inside, Marisol pressed her hands to her stomach, whispering a prayer that the standoff would break before bullets did. But in the desert, peace rarely lasted long. The desert air grew heavier with every heartbeat. Dust swirled at the hooves of the horses, and the rancher could feel the eyes of 4 armed men measuring him, waiting for a slip. The scarred leader sat tall in the saddle, his grin gone. "You're making a mistake, rancher. We've got more men not far behind. You think you can stand against us?" The rancher's jaw flexed, his eyes steady as flint. "I've stood against worse than you. You'll take nothing from this ground today." The younger outlaw, the same one who had nearly stepped onto the porch, snorted, his hand twitching toward the pistol on his hip. He was eager, reckless, the kind of man who mistook violence for courage. The rancher saw the motion before it fully came. Years of lonely survival on the frontier had honed his instincts sharper than any blade. The outlaw's hand snapped down, metal scraped leather. "Tori," but the rancher's revolver was already leveled, steady, the hammer drawn back with a click that cracked the silence like lightning. "Don't," the rancher said, his voice low, flat, absolute. The outlaw froze, half bent, hand still clutching the grip of his pistol, but not daring to lift it. Sweat beaded at his temple as he realized he'd been measured and beaten before the fight even began. The other 2 riders shifted uneasily in their saddles. They hadn't expected the old rancher to be this fast. The scarred man's face hardened, hiding his surprise. Inside the cabin, Marisol gasped softly, her eyes wide. Through the crack in the door, she saw him. This man who owed her nothing, standing between her and the men who claimed to own her. The sight struck her deeper than any words of comfort could have. The rancher's revolver didn't waver. His gaze swept the men like a hawk. "One of you tries that again, and I'll put him in the dirt. You can test me if you want, but you'll be the first to find out I don't bluff." For a long moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then the scarred man raised a hand, signaling the young outlaw to back off. Reluctantly, the man released his pistol and straightened, stepping back toward his horse. The tension didn't ease. It merely shifted. The outlaws weren't finished. They had been humiliated, and men like them never rode away without settling the score. The scarred man leaned forward in his saddle, voice low and venomous. "You've just bought yourself trouble, rancher. More than you can hold." The rancher lowered his revolver slightly, but his eyes never left theirs. "Trouble's nothing new." The riders pulled their reins, turning their horses back toward the ridge. Dust rose as they rode off, but the scarred man looked over his shoulder one last time. His glare promised they would return. The rancher holstered his revolver, his chest tight. He knew the fight wasn't over. It had only been delayed. Behind him, Marisol's voice trembled from the doorway. "They'll come back, won't they?" He looked at her, the weight of the desert heavy in his eyes. "Yes, and next time, they won't be alone." The cabin was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that rattled nerves. The rancher sat at the rough-hewn table, revolver laid out in front of him, the metal catching the last slant of daylight. He was oiling the barrel with slow, deliberate strokes. Every motion a habit burned deep from years of needing his gun to speak faster than words. Marisol sat by the fire, wrapped in a wool blanket. The flicker of flame lit her face, pale and weary, though her eyes carried a storm of secrets she had not yet given voice to. "They'll come back," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The rancher didn't look up. "I know." She hesitated, clutching the edge of the blanket. Then the words broke free, brittle but sharp. "It wasn't just my sisters. They didn't only sell me because I was with child. They sold me to them, to pay a debt." The rancher paused, his cloth stilling on the revolver's barrel. He raised his eyes slowly, his stare hard as iron. "What kind of debt?" Marisol swallowed, her throat dry. "Gambling, whiskey. My oldest sister's husband owed them more than he could ever pay. They threatened to burn the homestead, to take the cattle, to take everything. So they gave me instead." The rancher's jaw tightened, the muscle in his cheek twitching. He had seen men ruin themselves in cards and drink, but to trade away blood for silver? That was a sin even the desert itself seemed to spit on. "They said I'd be useful to the trader," she went on, her voice cracking. "But when he saw I was too weak, he passed me to the outlaws. To them, I was nothing more than property." Her eyes filled, but she forced the tears back. "Until you opened your door." The rancher leaned back, setting the revolver down. He rubbed a calloused hand across his face, the weight of her words pressing into him. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted to be drawn into someone else's hell. But now it was at his table, staring him in the eye. Outside, the night carried far-off sounds, wolves howling, coyotes yipping. But under it all was another rhythm, faint but steady. Horses. Not near, not yet, but moving. The rancher heard it, his instincts sharpened. He rose, crossing to the window, peering into the dark horizon. Marisol's voice followed him, trembling. "They won't stop. As long as I breathe, they'll hunt me." The rancher's silhouette was framed in the window, broad and solitary. His voice came low, steady as the land itself. "Then they'll find me, standing between you and them." In the distance, faint lanterns flickered on the ridge, like fireflies in the black. The riders were gathering, and the night was only beginning. The night deepened, heavy and restless. The rancher stood on the porch with his rifle cradled in his arms, the barrel glinting faintly under the moon. The lantern inside cast a warm glow across the yard, but beyond that light, the desert was a sea of shadows. Then the sound came, first a single hoofbeat, then another until the ground itself seemed to hum. The riders had returned. This time not 4, but a dozen at least. Their lanterns bobbed across the ridge like angry stars, their shouts carried by the wind. Inside the cabin, Marisol pressed her back to the wall, clutching her belly. She could hear the men, their voices cruel and mocking, the language of ownership and threat. She knew them, every tone, every sneer. It sent ice through her blood. The rancher's eyes narrowed. He had expected this, though not so soon. He set his rifle against the wall, checked the revolver at his hip, and then took a long, steady breath. The riders fanned out around the cabin, their horses restless, their silhouettes sharp in the moonlight. At their head, the scarred man sat tall in his saddle, his smile cold as the desert night. "You should have taken our offer," he called, his voice carrying across the dust. "We came polite the first time, but polite's worn thin." The rancher didn't move from the porch. His voice was calm, but it cut through the air like iron. "You'll leave empty-handed, same as before." Laughter rippled through the outlaws. One man lifted a torch, waving it so the flames licked high into the night. Another spat into the dirt and raised his rifle, the glint of steel sharp against the firelight. "Empty-handed?" the scarred man barked. "No, rancher. Tonight we take the girl, and we take whatever else we damn please. Stand in our way and you'll be the first to burn." Inside, Marisol bit her lips so hard it bled. She could almost hear her sister's voices again, the betrayal echoing through memory. But this time she wasn't alone. The rancher's gaze swept across the circle of riders, weighing each man, each weapon, each angle. He knew the odds. He was one against many, but he had chosen already. He stepped down off the porch, boots striking the dirt with a steady rhythm, revolver loose in his hand. The torchlight flickered across his face, calm and unyielding. "You'll get her over my grave," he said, his voice steady as bedrock. The scarred man's grin widened, teeth gleaming. He raised his hand and the riders tensed, ready. The desert held its breath. The scarred man's hand dropped. In the same instant, torches flared brighter and rifles lifted. The riders pushed their horses closer, the circle tightening around the cabin like a noose. The rancher moved with deliberate calm, his revolver loose at his side, his eyes fixed on the leader. He knew they wanted him to break, to stumble into fear. But fear was a luxury long stripped from him by years on the frontier. A rider on the left shouted and urged his horse forward, waving his torch high. The rancher raised his revolver, the hammer cocking with a metallic click that cut through the chaos. His voice carried steady. "One step closer and you'll meet the ground before your torch does." The rider pulled his horse up short, the animal rearing and screaming. Laughter broke out among the others, but it was the uneasy kind, edged with nerves. They had expected a farmer clinging to pride, not a man who stood like stone against the tide. Inside the cabin, Marisol crouched low, eyes darting between the shuttered window and the door. She could hear them outside, men shouting, horses stamping, the hiss of fire. Her heart hammered, and she pressed both hands to her stomach, whispering to the unborn child as if her words could build a shield. The scarred man dismounted slowly, his boots thudding into the dirt. The firelight danced across his ruined cheek as he stepped forward, sneer curling his lips. "You think you can keep her?" he growled. "You're one man, rancher, one, against us all." The rancher shifted his stance, his revolver steady at his side. "One's enough." For a moment, silence stretched thin as wire. Then one of the outlaws broke it, firing a shot into the air. Horses screamed, men shouted, and chaos ripped across the yard. The rancher dropped low, rolling to the side of the porch, returning fire. A bullet sparked off the water trough, another slammed into the cabin's wall. The night erupted with muzzle flashes, torches swinging wildly as shadows danced across the desert floor. Marisol cried out inside, ducking beneath the window as glass shattered. The firelight flickered across her terrified face, but she clamped her mouth shut, refusing to make a sound that could give her away. The scarred man barked orders, rallying his men. They wanted to break the door, to drag her out screaming, but the rancher was there, every shot precise, every move measured. He wasn't fighting to win a war. He was fighting to hold the line, to buy her another breath, another heartbeat. And for the moment, he held them. But the riders weren't finished, not by a long stretch. From the ridge, more lanterns flickered, reinforcements, their shapes crawling out of the darkness like a second wave. The rancher's breath caught, the weight of it settling in his chest. He had bought time, but not enough. The gunfire quieted for a breath, smoke curling low over the yard. Horses pawed the dirt nervously, their nostrils flaring as the acrid smell of powder drifted in the air. The rancher crouched behind the water trough, revolver hot in his hand, chest heaving. Then he saw them. More lanterns bobbing down the ridge. More riders, their silhouettes sharp against the pale moon. At least another dozen, maybe more. The first group spread apart to let them through, and the noose around the cabin tightened again. Inside, Marisol pressed her back against the wall, her breasts shallow. She had heard the crack of bullets, the shouts of men, the steady rhythm of the rancher's revolver answering each threat. But now there was something worse in the air, the sound of numbers too heavy to fight. The scarred man's voice rose above the others, triumphant and cruel. "You see, rancher, you can shoot down a handful, but we've got a river behind us. That girl's ours, and when we take her, You'll wish you'd never drawn iron." The men jeered, some firing shots into the air, others waving torches like they were already celebrating victory. The rancher's mind raced. He had faced long odds before, bad cattle drives, outlaw ambushes, border skirmishes. But this was different. This wasn't survival of himself alone. There was a girl inside carrying a child depending on him. He glanced toward the barn. Hay bales stacked high, barrels of water, the old wagon wheels propped against the wall. His land, his work, every piece of it could be turned to defense if he had enough time. But time was the one thing he didn't have. The riders began to move again, circling, calling out threats. One shouted to burn the cabin. Another laughed that the girl wasn't worth the trouble, until he named the price the traders had promised for her. Marisol heard it, her stomach twisting. She whispered, "Dios mío, they'll never stop." The rancher pressed his back against the trough, eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows. Running was impossible. Surrender was death. Fighting meant only delaying the inevitable. Unless he turned the ground itself against them. He looked again at the barn, the dry hay, the troughs, the narrow choke of the corral. A plan began to form. Not clean, not safe, but the only kind of plan men like him ever had. He reloaded, snapping the cylinder shut with a sharp click. His face hardened, lines deepening in the torchlight. If they wanted to fight, he'd give them a storm they wouldn't forget. The riders pressed closer, their torches painting the desert in swirls of firelight. The scarred man grinned like a wolf, certain he had cornered his prey. Around him, rifles clicked, horses stamped, the night charged with violence waiting to spill. But the rancher had moved. Silent as shadow, he slipped from the trough to the barn, his boots whispering over the dust. Inside, the dry hay crackled under his steps. He grabbed the lantern from its hook, his jaw set. When the first outlaw shoved open the barn door, he was met with blinding light. The rancher hurled the lantern into the hay and rolled aside. Flames leapt hungrily, racing up the bales, licking across the rafters. Horses screamed, men cursed. The barn became an inferno in seconds, throwing sparks into the sky. The circle of outlaws broke in chaos. Riders swerved, blinded by smoke. Torches slipped from hands, igniting patches of dry grass. The scarred man barked orders, but the fire roared louder, splitting their formation. From the porch, Marisol watched, her heart pounding. She saw the rancher emerge through smoke, rifle in hand, firelight blazing behind him. He didn't look like a man anymore, but like a figure carved from the desert itself, unyielding, unbroken. Shots rang out. The rancher dropped to one knee, firing into the confusion. His bullets weren't wasted. They cracked into wagon wheels, shattered barrels, drove horses wild. He turned the land against them, each corner of his ranch becoming a weapon. Outlaws fled in every direction, some thrown from their mounts, others vanishing into the dark. A few stayed, desperate, and rushed the cabin. The rancher stood in their path. He fought them close, the butt of his rifle cracking bone, his revolver barking fire. At last, the scarred man faced him, pistol in hand, sneer twisted with fury. "You should have left her," he spat. The rancher's voice was low, steady. "Some things ain't meant to be left." The scarred man fired. The rancher fired back. Two cracks split the night. When the smoke cleared, the scarred man staggered, dropped his gun, and crumpled into the dirt. Silence fell. The surviving outlaws spurred their horses, retreating into the desert, their shouts fading into the dark. The fire raged, but the ranch had held. The rancher lowered his weapon, chest heaving. He turned to the cabin. Marisol stood in the doorway, her face streaked with tears, the glow of fire flickering in her eyes. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rough. She stepped forward, trembling but strong enough to meet his gaze. "No, we're safe now." The night bled slowly into dawn. Smoke curled into the pale sky. The earth scarred but alive. For the first time in years, the rancher felt something stir in the ashes of his solitude. Something fragile, something worth keeping. A girl cast out, a child unborn, and a man who had nothing left but the will to protect. Out of betrayal and fire, a family had begun.